Fräulein Euler.
What's up, guys? CJ from Team... Hold on. It's hot under that thing. What's up, guys? CJ from Team Millennium Ninja here, and today I'm going to be taking a look back at Lupin III, The Woman Called Fujiko Mine, the gritty, dark, and mature show that brought Lupin back to its roots. But was that a good or a bad thing? Join me as I take a look back at one of the most unique Lupin series to date, and let's see if we can finally find out once and for all, who is the Woman Called Fujiko Mine? In January of 2012, it was announced that a new Lupin TV series would be released in April of that year in order to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the anime and the 45th anniversary of the manga. And it would be the first Lupin television series in almost 30 years, with the last being Lupin III Part 3, which finished airing in 1985, with movies and specials being released periodically every 1 to 2 years to fill that gap. But this would be Lupin's first true return to the small screen in nearly 3 decades. This time, however, not featuring the titular Master Thief in the title role, instead focusing on the series' classic femme fatale, Fujiko Mine. The show began airing in April of 2012 and finished in June of the same year to various critical acclaim, with critics citing its beautiful animation as well as its plot with its darker tone and well thought out narrative. But how did the show come to be in the first place? And after such a long hiatus of Lupin anime, why was this the one chosen to be the return? The project started with Sayo Yamamoto, a relatively new director to the industry, with her only main directorial work before this being Michiko and Hachin, a well-regarded if not super popular anime series. And she would also later go on to direct the Crunchyroll award juggernaut that was Yuri on Ice in 2016. But in 2010, Yamamoto was approached to produce a new Lupin TV series with full creative control, an offer that she accepted, making her the first female director to helm the Lupin franchise. And after having accepted the position, she decided to make the series an episode 0 to the original Lupin series, Part 1, wanting to take the show in a more adult, less family-friendly direction than it had been taken up to this point, being inspired most by Osumi's work on the first series as well as the original manga. Bringing on character designer Takashi Koike in order to reintroduce the audience to the original character designs from the manga. Now, where have I heard that before? And for the writing, Yamamoto would bring on Mari Okada as the main writer for the series, with the most notable titles she had worked on up to this point being Fate Stay Night, the original from 2006, Sasami Magical Girls Club seasons 1 and 2, which funnily enough I'll probably be talking about in my Tenchi Muyo videos at some point, as well as Toradora, Black Butler 1 and 2, Anohana, and the New Kyoto arc OVAs from Rurouni Kenshin, in addition to many other shows and movies before and afterwards, including Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans. And speaking of Gundam, the soundtrack this time around unfortunately was not composed by Yuji Ono, instead being composed by Naruyoshi Kikuchi, who would later go on to compose the Gundam Thunderbolt soundtrack, which was really well done and super jazzy, so it's a good sign of things to come. He would also do the soundtrack for the Thus Spoke Kishibe Rohan spin-off of JoJo's. And with Kikuchi composing the soundtrack, the role of music producer would be filled by none other than Shinichiro Watanabe, the legendary writer and director known for creating many classic anime, most notably probably being Cowboy Bebop, who was influenced heavily by Osumi in his work on the first Lupin series, making him a great fit for a project like this. And in addition to Watanabe, Yamamoto would also bring in legendary episode writer Dai Sato to write on a few episodes of the show. Mostly known for his work on Cowboy Bebop, Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, Samurai Champloo, and Eureka 7, a series that I highly recommend if you haven't watched. He's also contributed some writing to some more lower profile series like Space Dandy, and he even wrote the screenplay for the package segment from Halo Legends, which as a huge Halo fan, I found to be pretty freaking cool. Also, while doing research for this video, I ran across an old interview of his, which I highly recommend checking it out. I'll put a link in the description if you want to, as he talks about getting his start in television writing, as well as political messages and older anime. And the interviewer even asked him if he thinks The Boondocks is anime, which he just confirmed it is, by the way. And so with this all-star team of writers and directors, mostly from Cowboy Bebop and other associated works, under her helm, Yamamoto is poised to bring Lupin into the modern era. But how does the show hold up now, 10 years later? Is it still a must-watch in the Lupin franchise, or is it a weird experiment that should probably go overlooked? Well, let's find out. But before we get into that, I want to address a couple things about the show. The first is its mature nature. Yamamoto and the others came into this wanting to bring Lupin back to its less family-friendly incarnation, and a part of that meant ramping up the sexuality of our lead heroine, resulting in a lot of nudity, what some might call gratuitous, but whereas I think the nudity in something like Part 3 is gratuitous, due in most part to its more comical nature, here I think it really drives home the point of Fujiko using her sexuality as a weapon, which was always a part of her character since the very beginning. But if that's not your cup of tea, then this show probably won't be either. Though I will say that I think that the crew might have gone out of the way to make it not sexy, as I didn't really feel it was very sexy while watching it, and it kind of reminded me of Devilman Crybaby in that aspect. And the other thing I want to say is that I have watched this show before. 10 years ago when it first came out. So I'm going into this rewatch with fresh eyes. I don't remember anything about it. And what follows is basically my first impression of the show. The show starts off very episodically, with the first 7 episodes being individual stories, mostly covering Fujiko's various run-ins with the other main characters. But episode 8 and onwards begins an overarching plot until the end that also ties in with some of the earlier episodes. A similar show formula we wouldn't see repeated until about 10 years later with part 6. And the first episode of the show starts off with the introduction of Fujiko and Lupin as they infiltrate a cult that uses drugs to hypnotize its members, with both of them being after the big stash hidden away in the cult's vault, try saying that 5 times fast, in order to sell it for a high price, starting off immediately with a plot that brings Lupin back down to its gritty style, as while cults are no stranger to Lupin, I feel stealing and selling drugs doesn't really fly under the usual family-friendly banner, as well as all the nudity coming through right off the bat. Though I did feel this episode to evoke a feeling of the classic Lupin caper episodes, with Lupin at some of its very best in it, challenging Fujiko to see who could steal the treasure first and taunting her throughout. The plot of the episode also evokes a sense of the drug-crazed 60s and 70s to me, which I think is an intentional choice made by the writers in order to have it feel more like the time period around when part 1 took place. And speaking of whom, the writers also managed to throw in a couple of callbacks to Lupin and their other works in this episode, like the scene of Fujiko riding her motorcycle in front of the sunset as a reference to the ending from part 1, as well as Lupin doing the Cowboy Bebop finger gun at the end, which I thought was a great way to pay homage, as Lupin was a big inspiration to Watanabe. The next episode introduces Jigen and gives us some backstory on his gun, as well as his life before he met Lupin. Working as a bodyguard for various rogues and mafia families, it also had an interesting section at the beginning with Fujiko gambling against the owner of a casino, losing to her, who forces Fujiko to do this job of stealing Jigen's gun. And the episode turns out like a classic Jigen love story tragedy that also contextualizes his distrust of women. And it's a pretty solid episode, though the twist at the end is far from original. Next we get the introduction of Goemon to the series, bringing him back to his assassin roots as he takes a job to assassinate a king. Though while on board the train to do the job, Goemon runs into Fujiko, who is acting as a governess to the king's grandchildren. And I like how Goemon falls for Fujiko's act, and it actually influences him to change a little bit and act differently. Though I do wish we could have seen more of Goemon's cold-hearted assassin side. Also, as a quick side note, some of the noises Mike McFarland, who voice acts Goemon in the series, makes here are downright hilarious. And speaking of which, one thing I want to mention is that if you're long-term fans of Lupin, you might notice some of the voices in the series sound a bit off. And no, I'm not only talking about the dub, as while Funimation was responsible for the English dub where they changed the voice cast from the original classic English ones we all know and love.
Why the hell is Jigen voicing Zenigata?
The voices also changed in Japan before this show, with basically all of the main characters besides Lupin and Jigen being changed. So Funimation changing voice actors kind of fits, though I'm personally still not the biggest fan of Sunny Strait as Lupin. Now this leads us into episode 4, where Lupin does Phantom of the Opera, and I would tentatively call it the Zenigata episode, as Zenigata doesn't really get an episode just to himself in this series like all the other characters do, and this one seems to explore his character the most, even if it kind of flies in the face of his usual characterization. And don't get me wrong, I like serious Zenigata, and I wish we could get him more often, but as far as this series, and mostly this episode goes, it seems the writers really wanted him to have a more morally gray angle to him, and the way they go about doing it here is very questionable, making him more raunchy, taking advantage of Fujiko's position as a prisoner. And I'm not too familiar with the manga's version of Zenigata, but as far as the animated versions go, he's always been the moral center of Lupin, which you need in a show where the bad guys are the main characters. So having him act just as bad or worse in only this one interpretation is weird, and he comes off as really creepy in this episode, and the way he interacts with Fujiko specifically. Fortunately though, throughout the rest of the series they do dial it back, but in this episode I couldn't help but feel like I was watching Fujiko get bad touched by her uncle. Luckily, the end of the episode is much more wholesome, and in the next episode, we get the first meeting of Lupin and Jigen, as they're both trying to find a treasure hidden in an underground pyramid, and once they run into each other, the action in this episode really pops off, and it's everything you would expect from a Lupin versus Jigen conflict, ending up with them working together to traverse the pyramid, and afterwards, Jigen and Lupin agree to finish their fight some other time, which takes us to episode 6, where we focus more on Oscar, a brand new character exclusive to the series, who's kind of like a prototype to what we'd eventually see in Yada, an assistant to Zenigata who looks up to him as a more seasoned officer, though Oscar's admiration goes a bit further than Yada's, it seems. But I liked how Oscar was written here. He became Zenigata's foil to Fujiko, while Zenigata remained the foil for Lupin. Though I do think Oscar's character is fumbled at the end, but I'll talk more about that when I get there. As for this episode, it focuses on Oscar going undercover in an all-girls school in order to capture Fujiko, who's impersonating a teacher there. And while the premise is kind of interesting, this was probably my least favorite episode of the season, mostly to do with his focus on Oscar, as with him being the newest character, we don't really know that much about him yet, besides the fact that he's a walking Rose of Versailles reference and that he's in love with Zenigata, so I didn't find myself too invested in the story. But transitioning from my least favorite episode into my favorite episode of the series, we have episode 7, which was one of the 3 episodes written by Dai Sato for the series, the other before this being the Goemon episode, which was alright, but this episode blew my tits off. This was an absolute classic of an episode, covering an alternate retelling of the Cuban Revolution, Bay of Pigs invasion, and Cuban Missile Crisis, with Fujiko pretending to be a reporter close to an analog of Fidel Castro, where we see representations of the global superpowers squaring off against each other in real time, with this motif of the doomsday clock being moved closer and closer throughout the episode, with a pretty accurate depiction of the events referenced, save for maybe the Russians being portrayed as cartoony bad guys. And me being a sucker for historical drama like this, I really love this episode, and I really enjoy whenever Lupin veers into territory like this. It's as good as the franchise gets to me, and I wish we could get more stuff like this, especially on the historical side of things, as I've kind of become burnt out on the modern technology being so ever present in Lupin lately. And after this episode, the main plot of the series starts to trickle in, beginning in episode 8, Dying Day, where a fortune teller who can predict when people are going to die has gotten popular lately. But as it turns out, the only people who he's been telling the fortunes of are old victims of Lupin, with one of them hiring Jigen to destroy the machine he uses. Unfortunately, he was beaten to the punch by Fujiko and captured by the police. Luckily though for Jigen, Lupin bails him out, and not wanting to owe him any favors, Jigen offers to help Lupin investigate the fortune teller. And Lupin tracks down the fortune teller, where he ends up running into Fujiko when they're surrounded by the police. And as Fujiko goes to make her escape, the fortune teller predicts her dying day, which triggers something in her mind and causes her to kill him, beginning our descent into the discovery of Fujiko's past. Picking up in the very next episode, where we catch up with Jigen and Lupin, as Lupin seems to have brought Jigen along for another job, and with Jigen being broke with nowhere to stay, courtesy of him losing all his money and possessions save for his gun in the pyramid episode, he decides to come along with Lupin, and this seems to be the episode where their partnership is cemented. And I really like how their relationship develops throughout this series, with Jigen taking Lupin's job to make the best out of the situation, but after working with Lupin for a while, decides this way of life is just more interesting and sticks with them becoming legitimate friends later on down the road in other series. And this job they pull off is definitely one of the most interesting I can think of in the whole franchise, with their target being a painted woman. And as they try to steal her, they're pursued by Fujiko, who claims to want to steal her as well, but based on her actions, it seems more like she wants to kill her instead. And the chase that encompasses most of the episode is really interesting, utilizing several different locations and modes of transport to full effect. It's a non-stop joyride throughout, and with the mystery of why Fujiko is acting the way she is, makes it even more suspenseful, as you might think, or at least I did, that she's under some kind of mind control based on the last episode, but it turns out at the end that Lupin knows more about Fujiko's past than he's been letting on, telling her that the reason she wants to kill the girl is because she's like her, which sets up some questions to be answered later on in the next episode, which is a pretty trippy episode that plays around with time frames and illusions throughout. It turns out the reason Lupin knew about Fujiko's past is because he was approached to steal her by these owlmen, which turned out to be the reason that he went to the cult island in the first episode, giving some interesting continuity to that episode. But as Lupin infiltrates the mansion of the people who hired him before to find the answers, he's knocked unconscious and taken to an abandoned research lab nearby, where Zenigata also ends up later as he's investigating the connection between the owlmen and Lupin in a way that lets him show off how competent he is as an inspector, which I'm always appreciative of. It's here that Lupin runs into illusions that give him some backstory on the town and on Fujiko, which leads us into the next episode where Fujiko seems to be copying Lupin with her theft, sending notices ahead of time when she plans to steal something, which Zenigata notes is very unlike her, and it doesn't seem to be her, as she's been cooped up at Goemon's shack since we last saw her in the Painting Girl episode. And speaking of which, we get some more time with her and Goemon, where Goemon ends up setting off to try and find out more about her, which I think is indicative of the writers not really having much for Goemon to do here, since he can't interact with Jigen or Lupin in any meaningful way, because the one bit of continuity from part 1 is them meeting Goemon for the first time. But it's also funny when we see Lupin and Goemon walk past each other in the episode, and Goemon even ends up helping Lupin incidentally later on. But the main focus of this episode is Oscar, as it turns out he was the one imitating Fujiko in order to get Zenigata reassigned to her case, springing from his desire to have Zenigata pursue him instead. So he thought if he pretended to be Fujiko, Zenigata would treat him like he treated her in episode 4, if you catch my drift. Going so far as to even kill an officer to get his attention. And because of this, the Owlmen decide to use him in their plans as well, which ultimately does not end well for Oscar, as he comes back to his senses once Zenigata reminds him of where they both came from, giving us the backstory between the two, where Zenigata saved Oscar from drowning while he was trying to protect a coin from kids who were bullying him, a display that caused Zenigata to change himself afterwards as well. Unfortunately for Oscar though, he had slipped too far before realizing, and the only way to make things right were to sacrifice himself to stop the bomb from his plan. Though he doesn't end up actually dying here, which I thought would have been a fitting way to cap off his arc. And I actually thought this episode was pretty great. It actually made me interested and care a bit more about Oscar, despite his behavior in the episode making him much less likable, which I found to be interesting and sad, not only in terms of the story, but also that the series could do so much more for Oscar in just an episode than they've done for Yada over the course of 2 or 3 parts. And after this episode, we get the 2-part episode conclusion to the series, where the cast are all gathered to an amusement park, courtesy of the person who's been pulling the strings from the shadows the whole time, Count Luis U. Almeida. And as Zenigata and Fujiko proceed through the rides, Fujiko ends up gaining her memories that she had hidden away back, and are attacked by Fujiko lookalikes, with one of them being Oscar, as he was taken by the Owlmen after the last episode, since he wasn't killed by the explosion somehow. So Fujiko leaves this situation to Zenigata and heads off to find the Count. Meanwhile, Lupin and Jigen have arrived at the park, where they run into the Owlman who hired Lupin in the first place, who asks him to kill Fujiko, which Lupin declines, causing them to fight on a roller coaster, which is a really dope fight with some cool teamwork from Lupin and Jigen. We also see that Goemon was captured in the last episode after he incidentally helped out Lupin, where the Owlman dressed him to look like Fujiko before he ends up escaping from them. And at the end of the episode, Fujiko meets with the Count, leading into the next episode, where we find out that the Count is actually dead, and his research and legacy has been carried on by the little girl whose memories had been implanted into Fujiko, as she was trying to use the experiments to create a new version of herself that could live in the outside world, since her body had been ruined by the Count's experiments. But as she watched Fujiko, she became upset when she noticed Fujiko hid the memories away. So she came up with this plot in order to cause the memories to come back, leading to the events that took place in this series. And ultimately, Lupin and Fujiko take her away from her isolated life, where it also turned out that the owl guy protecting her was her mother, and they show her a bit of the outside world for herself before she ends up dying, with Fujiko proclaiming that this is her life and she can never have it. And the rest of the episode has some interesting stuff to it as well, like the Jigen versus Goemon fight, with them both being affected by the drugs, making them see each other as owl heads, which I thought was a great way to work the fight in here. But one thing that perplexed me was the ending with Oscar, as the last we see of him in the series is him driving a truck into the building to start a fire. And though I'm pretty sure he's still alive at the end, we don't get any kind of scene with him, like Zenigata taking him into custody where he could maybe get some of the mental care that he definitely needs, which makes me feel like bringing him back after the bomb explosion was kind of a waste, as it ruins the cap off of his character arc with no payoff to bringing him back, which kind of sucks because there was other stuff they still hadn't addressed about him, like the tattoo on his chest, which they never talked about in the series. And I've seen theories that postulate he was a failed Fujiko clone, which I thought at first as well, but I take umbrage with that idea for a couple of reasons. The first being the fact that it was outright stated all of the child experiments committed suicide. So if it is the case that Oscar was a failed experiment, it directly contradicts what we've been expressly told, with them not making clear that that is the case, which they could have easily done. And if it was their intention to leave it ambiguous like this, then they should have done that by not including the metric of all the kids not living. As well, I think it makes more sense of them experimenting on Oscar after they catch him instead, as it fits with the established facts that the kids didn't work, but experimenting on an adult like Fujiko did, meaning that them kidnapping Oscar in order to brainwash him after the explosion rather than him having been since he was a kid makes more sense, and maybe more a result of them putting Oscar in place to cause the events that happen in the series like they did with the others who weren't brainwashed by them. But after Oscar messed up the plan in episode 11, they took him to brainwash him, which is what I think makes the most sense in context. And so once again, I reiterate that I wish we had gotten at least something at the end with him. But that's how the season ends, with the rest of the story continuing in part 1. Maybe. It's kind of in the air whether or not this series is canon to the show or not, but as far as I'm concerned, I don't think there's any reason for it not to be. There's nothing contradictory in the series itself to events from the show, considering the Lupin canon is already loose at best. Though I do like how they were able to incorporate the backstory with Fujiko here. I was afraid that it was actually going to be her the whole time, which if it were would have been weird to look at supposed later events in the continuity retroactively, but thankfully I think the angle they took was a great one. Plus there's also the Koike verse movies, which follow up on the story from the series as well. I guess. Well, I'll find out when I get around to reviewing those. But I really enjoyed this series a lot more than I thought I would. Being a fan of part 1, I really liked how the art style and animation felt like a modernized version of part 1 without it feeling all that different, as well as the soundtrack, which feels like it pays homage to the part 1 soundtrack in certain ways. And as someone who loves that soundtrack, if albeit for the wrong reasons, I really like that attention to detail. And in terms of the writing and story, I think this team really captured the feel of Osumi's work while also making a really well structured and thought out series with an interesting plot as well as some super interesting one-off ideas, with my personal favorites being the aforementioned episode 7 and the Painting Girl episode for their super unique premises alone. And I know I already discussed episode 7 at length before, but I also really like the idea of the Painting Girl with the object of a heist being to steal a living person or thing, as it's a kind of plot that is similar to some older Lupin episodes, but is unique enough to stand out, as I don't think Lupin has done it this way before or since. And it was also a great plot device in the episode to establish Fujiko's frame of mind at the time. And of course, I also really enjoyed the 2-part finale, as they were packed with great action, as well as very satisfying endings to the story threads that had been built up throughout the season. Except for Oscar. So that about why does that keep happening? But that about does it for Lupin III, The Woman Called Fujiko Mine, a series that really surprised me, as I didn't really know what to expect coming in, but now I would definitely say it's one of, if not the best Lupin series I've seen to date, and I would highly recommend to anybody that's a fan of the darker, more adult side of Lupin. But what did you guys think of the series? And were you surprised as I was to find out how many Cowboy Bebop alums worked on this show? Make sure to let me know down in the comments, and also make sure to check out this collab I did with my buddy Morquez over on his channel, where we describe every episode of part 6 in 10 words or less. I appreciate you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time when I tackle part 4 for my very first time. Until then, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and this has been CJ from Team Millennium Ninja, headed back to the village, hidden in the internet. Hey, if anybody is watching this, this is my dog Rowdy here. I've had him since I was in high school, about 8-9 years now, and he's been in around some videos and some streams and stuff I made. Today's his last day with us, probably, so wanted to come in, get him on video, try and have something to remember him by. So if anybody else ends up watching this, yes, this is Rowdy. You know, I'd appreciate if whoever watches this would just remember that there was a dog named Rowdy, and he was a good boy. He deserved a lot better than he got in this world.